47,647, Chapter 35, Making of the Constitution for India, the Indian Constitution, which came into effect on January 26, 1950, has the distinction of being the longest in the world in terms of its length, content, and complexity owing to the country's size and diversity. Of the Constitution, India was deeply divided besides being large and diverse, and hence it was designed in a way to keep the country together. If in one way, it sought to make Indians of different classes, castes, and communities come together for a shared vision, in another way it sought to nurture democratic institutions in what had long been a culture of hierarchy and deference. Background: although the Constitution of India was framed between December 1946 and December 1949, its roots lie deep in the Indian national movement against the colonial rule, as well as in the movements for responsible and constitutional government in the princely states. Amritsula Mukherjee, in her work, India Since Independence, has rejected the idea that the British initiate a modern, responsible, and constitutional government in India, and that the 1950 Constitution was merely the culmination of the series of constitutional initiatives made by the British in 1861, 1892, 1909, 1919, and 1935. The fact that British 648, a brief history of modern India concessions at every stage, fell far short of what nationalists were demanding for. In the modern sense, there appeared the Constitution of India Bill, also known as the Home Rule Bill in 1895, which envisaged basic human rights such as freedom of expression, equality before the law, right to the inviolability of one's home, right to property, etc., for all citizens of India. Although there is no conclusive evidence to prove the authorship of the Home Rule Bill, Annie Besant believed that the bill was inspired by Tilak. In 1922, Mahatma Gandhi, in an article titled Independence, published in Young India, wrote that Swaraj would not be a free gift of the British Parliament, but a declaration of India's full self-expression. The Constitution of India would be framed as per the wishes of the Indians. The Commonwealth of India Bill, which was drafted in India and to which Annie Besant, Tej Bahadur Sapru, V.S. Srinivasa Shastri made important contributions, was accepted unanimously by the Executive Committee of the Parliamentary Labour Party. The bill had its first reading in the House of Commons in December 1925. It was defeated, but it proved crucial as it had the support of very wide sections of Indian opinion, and it specified in clear words that India shall be placed on an equal footing with the self-governing dominions. After the non-cooperation movement, Motilal Nehru in February 1924 introduced in the Central Legislative Assembly a resolution that gave due regard to minority rights and interests, and came to be known as the National Demand. It was passed by a large majority in the Assembly. For the first time, a demand for a constitution and the procedure for its adoption were expounded in clear terms. Britain, in response to the national demand, appointed the all-white Simon Commission in November 1927 to recommend further constitutional changes. In response to Lord Birkenhead's challenge, the Nehru Report, submitted on August 1928, was an outline of a draft constitution for India. Most of its features were later incorporated in the Constitution of Independent India. The report embodied not only the perspective of the contemporary nationalist opinion, but also an outline of a draft. Making of the Constitution for India, 649 Constitution for India. The latter was based on the principle of dominion status, with full responsible government on the parliamentary pattern. It asserted the principle that sovereignty belongs to the Indian people, laid down a set of fundamental rights, and provided for a federal system with maximum autonomy granted to the units, but residuary powers vesting in the central government and joint electorates for elections to the federal lower house, and the provincial legislatures with reservation of seats for minorities in certain cases for a limited period. In the aftermath of the Nehru Report, the Simon Commission was boycotted, and in December 1929, the Congress declared complete independence as its ultimate goal. The idea that India's constitution should be framed via Constituent Assembly, elected for this very purpose and based on the widest possible franchise, gained support. Although M.N. Roy had made such a suggestion earlier, Jawaharlal Nehru was the first national leader to enunciate the idea in 1933. The Congress took up the demand for a Constituent Assembly as a part of its official policy in 1934, after refusing the Simon Commission's recommendations of 1933 as no expressive of the will of the people. Jawaharlal Nehru declared that the Congress had proposed the Constitution of India must be framed, without outside interference, by a Constituent Assembly elected on the basis of adult franchise, and the Working Committee of the Congress reiterated this stand. At the Lucknow session of the Congress in 1936, It was declared that no constitution imposed by an outside authority and no constitution which curtails the sovereignty of the people would be acceptable to the Congress. In July 1937, after the Congress accepted office in a majority of provinces, Nehru pressed the legislators to introduce resolutions in the assemblies rejecting the present constitution and demanding a Constituent Assembly. In August, the CWC accepted a draft resolution prepared under Acharya Kripalani. Between August and October 1937, all the Congress-ruled provinces and Sindh passed this resolution and demanded repealment of the Government of India Act 1935 in September 1937 itself, a resolution recommending the 650. A brief history of modern India replacement of the 1935 Act by a constitution framed by a Constituent Assembly was introduced in the Central Legislative Assembly by S. Satyamurthy. The same demand was reiterated in the Haripura session of 1938. The Cripps proposals of 1942, though rejected by the Congress as unacceptable, had one redeeming feature in that it conceded the request of Indians to frame their own constitution through a Constituent Assembly. In September 1945, the newly elected Labour government in England announced that it planned to create a Constituent Assembly in India. On March 15, 1946, the Cabinet Mission came to India and, in the course of its stay, recommended the forming of the Constituent Assembly and b. an interim government. Constituent Assembly formation. It was decided that the Constituent Assembly was to be elected indirectly by the provincial assemblies. According to the plan, the provinces of British India were grouped into 3 categories, A, B, and C. Each province was allotted seats on the basis of the population, in the ratio of 1 member for 1,000,000. The seats given to a province were decided among 3 communities on the basis of their number, the 3 communities being the Muslims, Sikhs, and general including Hindus and all others who were not Muslims and Sikhs. They were to be elected by their representatives of each community in their respective legislative assemblies by the method of proportional representation with single transferable vote. The number of members allotted to the Indian states was also to be fixed in the same basis of population as adopted for British India, but the method of their selection was to be settled later by consultation. The strength of the constitution-making body was to be 389. Of these, 296 representatives were to be from British India, 292 representatives drawn from the 11 governors' provinces of British India, and a representative each from the 4 chief commissioners, provinces of Delhi, Ajmer Marwara, Coorg, and British Baluchistan, and making of the Constitution for India, 65,193 representatives from the Indian states. The states' representatives were to be nominated by the respective rulers. Elections for the 296 seats assigned to the British Indian provinces were completed by August 1946. The Congress won 208 seats, including all the general seats except 9, and the Muslim League 73 seats, that is, all but 5 of the seats allotted to Muslims. The 93 seats meant for the states, representatives remained vacant, and the princely states decided not to participate in the Constituent Assembly. However, representatives of some of the states, Baroda, Bikaner, Jaipur, Patiala, Rewa, and Udaipur, entered the assembly by April 1947, and by August 15, 1947, and soon after, all the states had sent their representatives to the assembly. The assembly was, however, not able to start its work immediately as Jinnah withdrew his acceptance and caused the Muslim League to boycott it. The Congress went ahead with its plan and appointed an expert committee to draft fundamental rights and arrange an early session of the assembly. The party also accepted the Viceroy's invitation to form an interim government, with Jawaharlal Nehru as Prime Minister. The Constituent Assembly opened on December 9, 1946 in the Constitution Hall, now the Central Hall of Parliament House at New Delhi. Jawaharlal Nehru moved the Historic Objectives Resolution on 13 December 1946, after it had been in session for some days. Their solution envisaged a federal polity with the residuary powers vesting in the autonomous units and sovereignty belonging to the people. The resolution gave to the Assembly its guiding principles and the philosophy of constitution making. 2 constituent assemblies, India and Pakistan. By the end of January 1947, it was clear that there was no possibility of the Muslim leagues joining the assembly. An uncompromising call for a separate constituent assembly for Pakistan had been given by Jinnah. On June 26, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the Governor-General of India, announced the setting up of a separate constituent assembly for Pakistan. 652. A brief history of modern India. The Indian Independence Act, 1947, passed with surprising speed, came into force on July 18, 1947. The Indian Independence Act, 1947, declared the Constituent Assembly of India to be a fully sovereign body. And on the midnight of August 15, 1947, the Assembly assumed full powers of the governance of the country. Section 8 of the Act conferred on the Constituent Assembly full legislative power. Evaluation of the Assembly for India. The Assembly, set up under the Cabinet Mission Plan, was a result of compromises made by the Congress on its ideological and philosophical sphere. The Assembly was not fully sovereign despite the efforts of the Congress, whereas the Congress' demand was for a fully sovereign Assembly, nor was it elected on the basis of universal adult franchises the Congress had demanded. The Congress caved in to accept communal representation too, and the grouping planned for the provinces. It also went along with the limits imposed in the powers of the central government. So, the Constituent Assembly setup was quite far from what the Congress had demanded in the later years of the freedom struggle. The Constituent Assembly was indirectly elected by the provincial assemblies, which themselves were elected on the basis of a limited franchise established by the Government of India Act of 1935. The 1935 Act imposed qualifications on the basis of tax, property, and education. This kept out more than 70% of the adult population from the voting. The Constituent Assembly thus reflected the composition of the provincial assemblies in which the Congress had a comfortable majority, which rose to more than 80% after partition. The composition of the Assembly reflected the different ideological views present in the country at the time. There were socialists, the Marxian as well as the democratic variety. Both groups were opposed to private ownership of important means of production and wanted an egalitarian society, while the Marxian variety wanted a revolutionary reconstruction. It was the more moderate group, of which Nehru was a member, preferring peaceful parliamentary. Making of the Constitution for India 653 Drafting Committee. 1. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Chairman. 2. G.B. Pant. 3. K.M. Munshi. 4. Aladi Krishnaswamy Utter. 5. N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar. 6. B.L. Mitra, later replaced with Madhav Rao. 7. Syed Muhammad Sadallah. 7. D.P. Khaitan died in 1948, and hence T.T. Krishnamacharya was appointed. Methods that held sway. Sardar Patel may be considered a leader of the rightist views supporting private enterprise. The rightist point of view was also represented by Purushottam Das Tandon and S.P. Mukherjee. There were also the Gandhians proposing decentralized village government through panchayats. All these viewpoints influenced the Constitution to an extent, but the dominant influence was that of the liberals and the democratic socialists. After independence with the independence of India on August 15, 1947, the Constituent Assembly became a sovereign body responsible for framing the Constitution as well as making ordinary laws. Now the work of Constituent Assembly was organized in 5 stages. First, committees were required to present reports on basic issues. Second, Benegal Narsingh Rao, a judge of the Calcutta High Court and also the constitutional advisor of the Constituent Assembly, prepared an initial draft on the basis of the reports of these committees and on his own research into the constitutions of other countries. Third, the Drafting Committee, under the chairmanship of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, presented a detailed draft constitution, which was published for public discussion and comments. Criticisms and counter-criticisms in the press in turn molded the nature of the consensus that was ultimately reached on specific issues. Fourth, the draft constitution was debated and amendments proposed. Fifth, the Constitution of India was adopted. Work, committees and consensus. When the Constituent Assembly first met on December 90, 1946, J.B. Kripalani, the then Congress President, proposed. 654. A brief history of modern Indiath name of Dr. Sachidanand Sinha, the oldest member of the Assembly, for the post of the Provisional President. Later, on December 11, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the President of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly appointed several committees for framing the Constitution. These committees submitted their reports between April and August 1947, and on the basis of these reports, Dr. B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor, submitted a draft of the Constitution by the end of October 1947. This draft contained 240 clauses and 13 schedules. In order to consider this draft constitution, a drafting committee under the chairmanship of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the law minister at the time, was set up. The other members were Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyengar, N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, K.M. Munshi, Syed Mohammad Sadallah, Sir B.L. Mitter, and D.P. Khaitan. After the first meeting, Sir B.L. Mitter resigned, and in his place N. Madhava Rao was nominated, and T.T. Krishnamacharya took the place of D.P. Khaitan on the latter's death in 1948. The drafting committee prepared the first draft of the Constitution. This was then circulated for the comments of jurists, lawyers, judges, and other public men. In the light of their comments and criticism, the drafting committee prepared a second draft which consisted of 315 articles and 9 schedules. This second draft was placed before the Constituent Assembly on February 21, 1948. The draft was then considered clause by the Assembly. The third reading commenced on November 14 and was finished on November 26, 1949. The preamble was adopted last. It had taken 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days to complete the task. As many as 7,000 odd amendments had been proposed and nearly 2,500 were actually discussed before the draft constitution was accepted. Dr. Ambedkar then moved a motion that the Constitution, as settled by the Constituent Assembly, be passed. On November 26, 1949, the people of India in the Constituent Assembly adopted, enacted, and gave to themselves the Constitution of the Sovereign Democratic Republic of India. Dr. Rajendra Prasad, as President of the Assembly, signed the document. The members of the Constituent Assembly appended. Making of the Constitution for India, 655 UANY claim for the sharing of power by the minority, is Khalid communalism, while the monopolizing of the whole power by the majority is called nationalism. B.R. Ambedkar their signatures to it on January 24, 1950, the last day off the Assembly. In all, 284 members actually signed the Constitution. The Constituent Assembly, besides drafting the Constitution of India, adopted the national flag on July 221,947, and adopted the national anthem and national song on January 24, 1950, the last day of its session. The Constituent Assembly elected Dr. Rajendra Prasad as the first president of India on January 24, 1950 late in the evening of August 14, 1947, the assemblement in the Constitution Hall, and at the stroke of midnight, took over as the Legislative Assembly of an independent India. The Assembly continued as the Provisional Parliament of India from January 26, 1950, till the new Parliament was installed after the first general elections. It must, however, be noted that while the formal centrus of the work of drafting the Constitution were, no doubt, the Constituent Assembly and the Drafting Committee, the Congress leaders held the important powers of decision-making. In a way, the Congress Working Committee was the real architect of the Constitution, in that most of the important decisions were arrived at on the basis of what the Congress leaders suggested. Granville Austin points out that for men, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, Rajendra Prasad, and Abul Kalam Azad, constituted a virtual oligarchy in the Assembly and dominated the proceedings by virtue of the prestige and power they enjoyed both in the Congress and in the government. The manner in which the Constituent Assembly arrived at decisions was that of consensus, defined by Granville Austin as the manner of making decisions by unanimity or near unanimity. An effort was made to smoothen differences and arrive at compromises and agreement. The objective was to overcome the biases and an element of overruling dissent ingrained in decision by majority. 656. A Brief History of Modern India. 656. Chapter 36. The evolution of nationalist foreign policy. One of the factors that facilitated India's ready interaction with the world outside, immediately on independence, was already well-established diplomatic engagement even under colonial rule. At independence, India was a member of 51 international organizations and a signatory to 600-odd treaties. India had signed the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, largely as a result of having contributed more than 1 million soldiers to that war. In the 1920s, it was a founding member of the League of Nations, the International Labor Organization, and the International Court of Justice. It participated in the Washington Conference on Naval Armaments in 1921-22. From 1920, there was an Indian High Commissioner in London. Even before the First World War, Indian nationals were staffing a few diplomatic posts. It was no accident that Indians formed the largest and most influential non-Western contingent in the United Nations and Allied agencies very soon after independence. The basic framework of India's foreign policy was structured much before 1947. A significant and inevitable fallout of the Western influence on the nationalist intelligentsia was a growing interest in and contact with the dominant international currents and events. Gradually, the nationalist thinkers Camito realized that colonialism and imperialism had an international. The evolution of nationalist foreign policy, 657 character, and much wider implications. With the development and crystallization of an anti-imperialist nationalist ideology, there emerged a nationalist foreign policy perspective. The evolution of this policy perspective can be traced under the several phases. From 1880 to First World War, anti-imperialism and Pan-Asian feeling. After 1878, the British undertook a number of expansionist expeditions which were opposed by the nationalists. The expeditions included Black Circle, the Second Afghan War, 1878-80. Black Circle, the dispatch of troops by England in 1882, to suppress the nationalist uprising by Colonel Arabi in Egypt. Black Circle, annexation of Burma in 1885. Black Circle, invasion of Tibet under Curzon in 1903. And Black Circle, a number of annexations during the 1890s in the Northwest to stop the Russian advance. The nationalists supported the tribal resistance to these adventures by the British. In place of an aggressive imperialism, the nationalists advocated a policy of peace. C. Sankaran Nair, the Congress president in 1897, said, "Our true policy is a peaceful policy." The emerging themes during 1880-1914 were 1. Solidarity with other colonies fighting for freedom. such as Russia, Ireland, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, Sudan, Burma, and Afghanistan, too. Pan-Asian feeling reflected in Black Circle condemnation of annexation of Burma in 1885. Black Circle inspiration from Japan as an example of industrial development. Black Circle condemnation of the participation of Japan in the international suppression of the Ihotuan uprising. 1895. Black Circle condemnation of the imperialist efforts to divide China. 658. A brief history of modern India. Black Circle defeat of the Tsarist Russia by Japan, which exploded the myth of European superiority, and Black Circle Congress support for Burma's freedom. World War I. The nationalists supported the British Indian government in the belief that Britain would apply the same principles of democracy for which they were supposed to be fighting. After the conclusion of the war, the Congress insisted on being represented at the peace conference. In 1920, the Congress urged the people not to join the army to fight in the West. In 1925, the Congress condemned the dispatch of Indian Army to suppress the Chinese Nationalist Army under Sun Yat-sen. 1920s and 1930s. Identifying with socialists in 1926 and 1927, Nehru was in Europe, where he came in contact with the socialists and other leftist leaders. Earlier, Dadabhai Naoroji attended the Hague session of the International Socialist Congress. He was a close friend of H.M. Hyndman, the famous socialist. Lajpat Rai also made contacts with the American socialists during his visit to the USA from 1914 to 1918. Gandhi had close relations with Tolstoy and Roland Ramin. In 1927, Nehru attended the Congress of Oppressed Nationalists at Brussels on behalf of Indian National Congress. The conference was organized by political exiles and revolutionaries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, suffering from political and economic imperialism. Nehru was one of the honorary presidents along with Einstein, Madame Sun Yat-sen, Roland Ramin, and George Lansbury. Nehru came to understand the international character of U.S. imperialism during his European experience. Nehru was also nominated to the Executive Council of the League Against Imperialism. The Congress also decided to open a foreign department to be in touch with the other people's movements. In 1927, Nehru also visited the Soviet. The evolution of nationalist foreign policy, 659 Union, and was very impressed by the achievements of the infant socialist state. He saw Russia as a bulwark against imperialism. After 1936, anti-fascism. The 1930s saw the rise of fascism in Europe and the struggle against it. The nationalists saw imperialism and fascism as organs of capitalism. They lend support to the struggle against fascism in other parts of the world in Ethiopia, Spain, China, and Czechoslovakia. In 1939, at the Tripuri session, the Congress dissociated itself from the British policy which supported fascism in Europe. In 1939, the Japanese attack on China was condemned by the nationalists. The Congress also sent a medical mission under Dr. Adel to China. On the Palestine issue, the Congress lent support to the Palestinians. It expressed sympathy with the Jews, but urged that the Palestinians not be displaced, and that the issue be settled by direct dealing between the Jews and the Arabs without Western intervention. It also opposed the partition of Palestine. After independence, Nehru is often called the architect of independent India's foreign policy. He realized the importance of the need to have direct contact with other nations, and to cooperate with them in enhancing world peace and freedom. He also understood the importance of maintaining an identity as a free nation, and not become a satellite of any other nation, however mighty. In his address to the Constituent Assembly on December 4, 1947, Nehru laid the foundations of India's foreign policy. The art of conducting the foreign affairs of a country lies in finding out what is most advantageous to the country. We may talk about peace and freedom and earnestly mean what we say. But in the ultimate analysis, a government functions for the good of the country it governs, and no government dare do anything which in the short or long run is manifestly to the disadvantage of the country. 660. A brief history of modern India. The main challenge to Nehru was to evolve a policy that could help India compete on the world arena with the modern states. And for that, he realized, a drastic socio-economic and technological transformation of the country was required. His objective was to transform India without becoming dependent on any particular country or group of countries to the extent of losing independence of thought or policy. What India needed was peaceful relations with all nations so that it could concentrate on its developmental efforts, and relations good enough for it to get the necessary help in that direction without compromising its freedom. In circumstances, non-alignment seemed to be the right policy. Panchsheel and non-alignment are the foundations of India's foreign policy. Panchsheel. It was on April 29, 1954, that Panchsheel, or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, were first formally enunciated in the Agreement on Trade and Intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India. It was stated in the preamble to this agreement that the two governments had resolved to enter into the agreement on the basis of 5 principles, namely, I. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Roman 2. Mutual non-aggression. Roman 3. Mutual non-interference. Roman 4, equality and mutual benefit v. Peaceful coexistence. In June 1954, when the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, visited India, he and his Indian counterpart, Jawaharlal Nehru, a joint statement elaborated their vision of Panchsheel as the framework for the relations between the two countries, well as the basis on which relations with other countries should be maintained. The two leaders expressed the hope that Panchsheel will also help in creating an area of peace which, as circumstances permit, can be enlarged, thus lessening the chances of war and strengthening the cause of peace all over the world. The evolution of nationalist foreign policy. 661. Historical perspective on Panchsheel. In the classical language, the word sheel doesn't mean principle but character. The term is taken from the Indonesian usage of the word, and Indonesians may have been influenced by the Buddhist use of the word sheel. Most Indians think Panchsheel was Jawaharlal Nehru's valuable contribution to the world, as it first received world attention when he and Zhou Enlai issued a joint statement in Delhi on June 18, 1954. In fact, the credit for formulating these principles should go to Zhou. While receiving the Indian delegation to the Tibetan trade talks on December 31, 1953, he enunciated them as 5 principles governing China's relations with foreign countries. Tian Kal, a joint secretary in the External Affairs Ministry at the time or Director General for Asian Affairs in Delhi, was impressed and conveyed his appreciation and the significance of these principles to Nehru, with whom he enjoyed a close rapport. Nehru agreed, and Kal took the initiative to mention them at the very outset of his draft text of agreement. That was in January 1954. However, the response from the Chinese Foreign Office was in the negative. At the time, Zhou wasn't in China. When Zhou returned to Peking, he, with his native genius for compromise, found a via media. He suggested that the 5 principles may not be included in the main text prominently, but could appear in the preamble. India accepted the compromise. But months later, when Zhou visited Delhi, Nehru and Kal emphasized these principles in the joint statement issued on June 18, 1954. China's hesitant formulation caught worldwide attention because of Indian sponsorship. Zhou propounded the principles, but Kal picked them up and Nehru propagated them. Nehru enjoyed high regard in the NAM, and soon, other Asian countries like Burma and Indonesia followed suit. Nehru and Zhou were leaders who strove hard to forge clausities between India and China and usher in a better world order through Panchsheel. Their efforts, however, were undermined and undone by the machinations of self-seeking or vindictive colleagues, and they died disenchanted men. Source: an article by V.V. Paranjp, formerly Chinese language expert to the Government of India, in the Hindustan Times of June 2004. 662. A brief history of modern India as per the documents of the Ministry of External Affairs. Panchsheel was incorporated into the 10 Principles of International Peace and Cooperation, put forward in the declaration issued by the April 1955 Bandung Conference of 29 Afro-Asian countries. The universal relevance of Panchsheel was emphasized when its tenets were incorporated in a resolution on peaceful coexistence presented by India, Yugoslavia, and Sweden, and unanimously adopted on December 11, 1957, by the United Nations General Assembly. And in 1961, the Conference of Non-Aligned Nations in Belgrade accepted Panchsheel as the basic principles at the center of the non-aligned movement. Non-alignment. The global environment that India faced after independence was very different from what existed before the Second World War. The major players on the world stage before the war, namely the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Japan, lay subdued, their vast empires shrunken or shrinking fast. The United States, which had followed an isolationist policy, keeping aloof from active international involvement, became dramatically active. The Soviet Union had acquired unprecedented influence in Eastern Europe, besides gaining recognition as a powerful state for crushing the German might on the Eastern Front, where most of the German military casualties had occurred. If the U.S. demonstrated its nuclear weapon capability in 1945, the USSR followed suit with its own nuclear test in 1949. The Cold War that began in the wake of the Second World War had no precedent in history. Almost the entire developed world was divided in Totwo opposing nuclear-armed blocs, with the U.S. and the USSR leading as superpowers. The balance of power diplomacy of the pre-war years thus disappeared from the industrialized countries. The Third World became a surrogate field for superpower competition. Meanwhile, decolonization was proceeding apace, and more independent countries were emerging, mostly in Asia and Africa. China was aligned with the Soviet Union till the mid-1950s. India found itself the largest country with the ability to maneuver between Thetwo blocks. The evolution of nationalist foreign policy. 663. At this point of time, the Soviet Union did not possess the economic or military support capability to influence the countries emerging from the colonial yoke. It was the West which tried to incorporate the newly independent countries into its strategic grouping. Alignment with the West was economically attractive, but it would have created a dependent relationship, which was seen by most of the newly independent countries as obstructive to a self-reliant development. The idea of aligning with the communist bloc was not possible for India, in spite of its socialist leanings. It could not visualize a Chinese-type restructuring of the society and economy, being basically attuned to a liberal democratic political vision. Political non-alignment was, therefore, prudent as well as pragmatic. The principles of non-interference in the domestic affairs of other countries and maintenance of one's own sovereignty, which are the basic postulates of India's foreign policy, evolved into the crystallization of the concept of non-alignment. The term non-alignment got currency in the Post-Bandung Conference, 1955. Non-alignment implies 5 criteria of non-alignment. The preparatory committee of the first non-aligned conference laid on the following 5 criteria of non-alignment. A country should follow an independent policy based on peaceful coexistence and non-alignment. Roman 2, it should have consistently supported national freedom movements in other countries. Roman 3, it should not be a member of multilateral military alliances concluded in the context of superpower conflicts. Roman 4, if it has conceded military bases, these concessions should not have been made in the context of superpower conflicts. V, if it is a member of a bilateral or regional defense arrangements, this should not be in the context of superpower politics. 5 pioneering leaders of the NAM. I. President Tito, original name Josip Broz of Yugoslavia. Roman 2, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Roman 3, President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. Roman 4, President Sukarno of Indonesia. V. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru of India. 664. A brief history of modern India's active refusal of a state to align itself with either party in a dispute between 2 power blocs. In the Conference of Non-Aligned Powers, the first non-aligned movement or NAM summit, held in Belgrade in 1961, and attended by 36 Mediterranean and Afro-Asian powers, Jawaharlal Nehru explained the essence of non-alignment. We call ourselves the Conference of Non-Aligned Countries. Now the word non-aligned may be differently interpreted, but basically it was used and coined almost with the meaning non-aligned with greater power blocs of the world. Non-aligned has a negative meaning, but if you give it a positive connotation, it means nations which object to this lining up for war purpose, military blocs, military alliances, and the like. Therefore, we keep away from this, and we want to throw our weight, such as it is, in favor of peace. Non-alignment is the characteristic feature of India's foreign policy. India was one of the founder members of NAM. In the Cold War era, India refused to favor any superpower and remained non-aligned. Non-alignment, however, is not to be confused with neutrality. A neutral state remains inactive or passive during hostilities between 2 blocs. Neutrality is maintained basically in times of war, whereas non-alignment has relevance both in times of war and peace. Neutrality is equivalent to passivity. A neutral country has no opinions, positive or negative, on issues at all. However, adherence to non-alignment is to have positive and constructive opinions on international issues. India has firmly and convincingly asserted its non-aligned, and not neutral, stand in various issues. Non-alignment, as one of the principles of India's foreign policy, attempts to promote international peace, disarmament, and territorial independence. It aims at democratization of international relations by putting an end to imperialism and hegemony and establishing a just and equal world order.